I didn't call her back. My daughter sent me a text on a Tuesday morning. I remember because I had just come in from shoveling the front steps. That wet, heavy snow we always get in late November here in Sudbury. And I was still pulling off my boots when my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I picked it up, read the message, and then I set the phone face down and went to make myself a cup of tea. The message said, "Mom, I need you to stop texting me every day. I'm an adult. I have my own life. You're suffocating me. And honestly, I'm exhausted by you." I stood at the kettle and waited for the water to boil, and I thought, I am 63 years old. I shoveled my own driveway this morning. I go to my book club on Wednesdays. I have a pension and a small house that I paid off 4 years ago, and I have never once, not in 38 years of working, asked anyone for a single thing I couldn't give back. And I said nothing, not because I was too hurt to speak, not because I didn't have words. I had plenty of words. I had been rehearsing those words for about 2 years, if I'm being honest. But I'd learned something by then that I wish someone had told me when my daughter was young, and I was still under the impression that love meant making yourself available at all hours. That a good mother answers every call, absorbs every mood, rearranges every plan. Silence, when you've earned the right to it, is not weakness. It's the only honest answer some people will ever understand. Let me go back a little, because this story doesn't start with that text message. It starts much earlier. It starts the way these things usually do, so gradually that you don't realize what's happening until you're standing in your own kitchen, wondering how you became the problem. My daughter's name is Vanessa. She's 31. She was born in October, a few days after Thanksgiving, and I used to joke that she came into the world already expecting a feast. She was a bright kid, funny, a little dramatic the way some children are, and I loved her more fiercely than I can describe. When her father and I separated, she was 14. I worked overtime at the school board office for 3 years so she wouldn't feel a single change in her quality of life. New winter coat every year, dance lessons, school trips, whatever she needed. That was my first mistake, I think. Not the love. The love was real and I don't regret it. But somewhere in there I taught her that my job was to make sure she never felt the weight of anything. She met her husband Troy when she was 24. He was from outside of Hamilton, came up to Sudbury for a mining job that lasted about 8 months before the contract ended. He had this easy way about him, very charming, always had a story. The kind of man who could walk into any room and make everyone feel like he'd known them for years. I tried to like him. I genuinely tried. What I noticed, slowly, then all at once, was that Troy didn't keep jobs. Not because he was lazy exactly. He had ideas, big ones. He wanted to open a food truck. Then he wanted to flip houses. Then he wanted to start a landscaping business. Each idea arrived with the same energy, the same absolute certainty, and each one required a little bit of seed money to get started. The first time Vanessa called to ask for help, she framed it as a loan. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters. She said loan, and she meant it, I believe. She was embarrassed to ask. She cried a little on the phone. Troy had an opportunity, a used commercial fridge for the food truck, a real deal, only available for a few days, and they were just a bit short. Could I lend them $2,000? They'd pay it back by spring. I transferred the money that same afternoon. Spring came and went. I didn't say anything. I told myself they were still getting started, that it was hard for young people, that I remembered what it was like to be in your 20s with bills and ambition and not enough runway. I believed all of those things, and I also, if I'm truthful, believed that bringing it up would make me look petty. That was my second mistake. Silence in that direction, swallowing the question, pretending the money was a gift because asking for it back felt uncomfortable. That kind of silence is corrosive. It teaches people that there are no consequences to taking from you. The food truck idea faded. Troy pivoted to real estate. He took an online course, got his license, spent 6 months trying to build a client base in a market that was not particularly welcoming to new agents without connections. Vanessa was working as a dental receptionist, covering most of their rent in Barrie, where they'd moved after his mining contract ended. And she was tired and stretched thin. And when she called me now, the calls had a different quality. Less catching up, more circling towards something. The second time she asked for money, it was $4,000. They were behind on rent, just 1 month, but their landlord was difficult. There'd been some miscommunication, and they really didn't want to have a mark on their record because they were hoping to qualify for a mortgage the following year. Could I help? I said yes. The third time, she didn't call it a loan. I noticed that. She said, "Mom, we're really struggling right now, and I just need you to help us out. Not borrow, not loan, help out. Like I was a social service. Like my money was a resource she was entitled to access when her own ran short." I wired $3,000. Afterward, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, and I did the math in my own head, and I realized that over about 18 months, I had quietly given my daughter just under $10,000, and not a single dollar had come back, and we had never once had a direct conversation about any of it. What I hadn't told Vanessa, what I hadn't told anyone, was that the year before, I had been diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer. I went through a lumpectomy and 6 weeks of radiation. I drove myself to most of my appointments. I told my sister Helen, and I told 2 women from my book club, and I specifically did not tell Vanessa because I didn't want her to worry. But also, and I've had to sit with this, because I think some part of me already knew that her response would be more about what it meant for her than what it meant for me. I was right, as it turned out. When I did eventually tell her, about 2 months after I'd finished treatment and gotten a clear scan, she cried on the phone and then said, "Why didn't you tell me? I could have helped. I could have come up." And then, about 4 minutes into that conversation, she mentioned that they were having a hard month and wondered if I had anything I could spare. That was the moment something shifted in me. Not broke. Shifted. Like when you've been carrying a piece of furniture at a bad angle for too long and your body quietly decides it won't do it anymore. I said I didn't have anything to spare right now. She went quiet, then said, "Okay," that she understood, and we said goodbye. I hung up, and I stood in my kitchen and I thought, I just had cancer, and I kept it to myself for months, partly to protect her, and the first conversation we've had about it ended with her asking me for money. I started, around this time, seeing a counselor. Her name was Patricia, and she had an office above a pharmacy on Lawn Street, and she charged on a sliding scale. And she was the first person in my life who said to me, plainly and without judgment, "You've been teaching your daughter that you don't have needs." I thought about that for a long time. I had taught my daughter by example and by habit that I was fine, always fine, that my house was a place she could call when things got hard and always find a soft landing, that my voice on the other end of the phone meant comfort and resources and no complications. I had been so careful for so long not to be a burden to her that I had disappeared as a person entirely. I wasn't a mother to her anymore. I was a function. Patricia asked me what I was afraid would happen if I said no. I thought about it for a while. Then I said, "I'm afraid she'll stop calling altogether." Patricia said, "And if she only calls when she needs something, what exactly would you be losing?" I went home and thought about that question for 3 days. Things came to a head in September. Vanessa called on a Sunday afternoon. I was in the middle of making soup, a big batch of chicken and vegetable that I was planning to freeze in portions, something I do every fall, and after about 4 minutes of small talk, she got to it. Troy had an idea for a landscaping business. He priced out the equipment. They needed someone to co-sign a small business loan from the RBC, nothing huge, $30,000, and they were hoping I would do it. I asked her to explain what co-signing meant in practical terms. She said it just meant my name on the paper, that Troy would be making the payments, that I wouldn't need to do anything. I said, "Vanessa, if I co-sign, I'm legally responsible if the payments aren't made. You know that, right?" She said Troy had a real plan this time. She said she really believed in him. She said this was different from the other times. I said I needed to think about it. What I was actually thinking was, there have been no other times when your belief in him has turned into money. I got back. I spoke to Patricia that week. I spoke to my sister Helen, who had always been more clear-eyed about this than me, and who said not unkindly, "Lorraine, you've been her safety net so long, she's forgotten there's a ground." I called Vanessa back 4 days later, and I said no. I couldn't co-sign the loan. I said it clearly, without a long explanation, without apologizing. I said I loved her, and I wished them well with the business. But I couldn't put my home and my retirement at risk. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I can't believe you. After everything I've been through, I've been struggling for 2 years and you won't do one thing for me." I said, "I've given you close to $10,000 over the past 2 years and I don't think you're aware of that." Another silence. Then, "Are you seriously keeping score? That's so hurtful." "I thought you were my mother." I said, "I am your mother. That's why I'm saying no." She hung up. 3 days later, the text arrived. The one about me suffocating her. About her being exhausted by me. I want you to think about the geometry of that, because I did. I thought about it for a long time. I had just, for the first time in 2 years, declined a request, and the response was that I was too much. That I needed to back off. That my presence in her life was a burden. And I put the phone down, and I made my tea, and I said nothing. What I did instead was this. I called my bank and I made an appointment with a financial advisor, a woman named Susan, who helped me put together a clearer picture of what my retirement actually looked like, what I could reasonably afford to give away and what I needed to hold on to. I had been operating under this vague guilt for years, feeling like I had more than her, and that this created an obligation. What Susan showed me gently was that my pension was not large, that my house was my primary asset, and that a $30,000 cosign going wrong could cost me everything I'd spent 38 years building. I joined a hiking group that fall, Wednesday mornings the same day as my book club, which meant Wednesdays became the day I was unavailable. There's a trail that runs north from Bell Park along the lake, and in the morning when the light comes through the birch trees, it's so quiet and clean that it's hard to believe anything in the world could be wrong. I didn't call Vanessa. I didn't text. I'd read enough by then to understand that what I was doing was not punishment. It was not the silent treatment the way some people practice it, weaponized and mean. It was simply that I had nothing left to say. I had said the thing. She had responded. Now it was her turn to sit with it. 2 months passed. November became December, and I put up my Christmas lights alone, which I've done for years and honestly prefer. No one to argue about the order of the boxes. And I made my plans to spend the holidays with Helen and her family in Guelph. The call came on a Friday evening, the second week of December. I almost didn't answer. Then I thought, she's my daughter, and I picked up. Her voice was different, smaller somehow. She said, "Mom." I said, "Hi, sweetheart." She started to say something about how things had been hard, and then she stopped. And then she said, "Troy and I are separating." I sat down. She told me it had been coming for a while, that the loan application had been turned down, not because of my refusal to co-sign, she was careful to say, but because of his credit history. That they'd had a very bad fight about it, and then more fights, and eventually she'd asked him to leave. That she was in the apartment alone, and she'd had some time to think, and that she wanted to call me. I said, "I'm glad you called." She was quiet for a minute. Then she said, "I owe you an apology. A real one. I've been treating you badly for a long time. I didn't say, 'Yes, you have.' I didn't say, 'I told you so.' I didn't perform forgiveness either. That quick reflexive absolution that women of my generation are trained to offer. The immediate, 'Oh no, sweetheart, it's fine, it's all fine.' Because it wasn't entirely fine. And she deserved to know that. I said, 'I appreciate you saying that. And I think we have some things to talk about. Not tonight. But I want you to know I'm here.' She cried a little. I let her. I didn't rush to fix it. In January, she drove up from Barry to Sudbury for the first time in over a year. She arrived on a Saturday morning and I had made coffee and a coffee cake, a recipe my mother used to make, brown sugar and cinnamon through the middle. and we sat at my kitchen table for 4 hours. We talked about things I hadn't said in years. I told her about the cancer, the real version, what it had actually been like to drive myself to those appointments. I told her about the $10,000, not to be cruel, but because she needed to know. Because I needed her to understand the shape of what had happened, not just the part where I finally said no, but the years before that when I kept saying yes, and it cost me something I couldn't name but could feel. She listened. She was quiet in a way I haven't seen from her since she was very young. That particular stillness that means someone is actually taking something in rather than just waiting to respond. She said, I didn't know about the cancer. I know you said you didn't want to worry me, but I want you to know. I should have been there. I should have been paying more attention. I said, yes, you should have. That was a hard sentence to say. I felt it leave my mouth like something I'd been holding for a long time. And she received it. She didn't deflect or explain. She just nodded and said, you're right. We cried. Not a lot. We're both fairly private people when it comes to that kind of thing, which is funny because we're more alike than either of us usually admits. She's been coming up once a month since then. She got a better job, administrative coordinator at a medical clinic in Barry. And while things are still tight, she seems to be managing. She doesn't ask me for money. When I offer to pay for dinner, she says, Mum, I've got it. The first time she said that I had to look out the window for a moment. I'm not telling this story because everything is perfect. It isn't. We're still finding our footing, still learning how to be in each other's lives in a way that is honest rather than just habitual. There are moments when I can feel her slipping back toward old patterns, and I know she can probably feel me bracing when she does, and we're both trying to be conscious of it. But here is what I know. The 2 months of silence that felt at the time like the hardest thing I'd ever done. Harder than the radiation, harder than the separation from her father, harder than any of the long years of just managing. Those 2 months were the most honest thing I had done for her in years. I had spent so long being available that I had made myself invisible. When I stopped answering, she had to look at the space where I used to be. And for the first time in a very long time, she actually saw me. I still go hiking on Wednesday mornings. The group has grown. There are 9 of us now, mostly women my age, some a little younger, and we walk the trail along the lake and talk about our grandchildren and our gardens and the books we're reading. And sometimes, when the conversation goes quiet and there's just the sound of boots on frozen ground and the birch trees standing white against the sky, I think about how much of my life I spent shrinking myself to fit inside other people's comfort. I bought myself a small watercolor set last spring. I'm not good at it. I paint mostly landscapes, the view from my back porch, the lake at different times of day. Helen says my trees look like broccoli. She's not wrong. It's enough. For the first time in a very long time, this quiet life I've built, the soup in the freezer and the hiking boots by the door and the bad watercolors on the windowsill, it is genuinely, completely enough. I think about the kettle a lot. That Tuesday morning in November, boots still wet from the snow, phone face down on the counter, water coming slowly to a boil. It would have been so easy to pick that phone back up, to type something, to explain myself, justify myself, chase after a version of the relationship I'd already been chasing for years. I didn't. And that moment, that small, quiet choice to just let the kettle boil, turned out to be the most honest thing I'd done in a very long time. What I've come to understand is that the way things unfolded between Vanessa and me wasn't random. It followed a logic, even when it didn't feel like one. I had spent years making myself easy to take from, not because I was weak, I don't think I was weak, but because I had confused love with availability and generosity with the erasure of my own limits. Every time I transferred money without saying anything, every time I swallowed the question about repayment because it felt uncomfortable, I was teaching her something. I was teaching her that my discomfort didn't matter, that my needs were flexible, that I would absorb whatever she needed absorbed. She learned that lesson well. She learned it because I taught it, consistently, for years. That's a hard thing to sit with. It would be easier to cast her as simply ungrateful, or Troy as simply a bad influence, and leave it there. But the truth is more complicated and more useful than that. The dynamic between us was built slowly by both of us, and it took both of us to start changing it. What changed in me wasn't bitterness, it was clarity. Patricia, my counselor, helped me see that real care for another person sometimes looks like refusal. That saying no to co-signing that loan wasn't me abandoning my daughter. It was me finally treating her like an adult who was capable of facing the consequences of her own choices. It was, in a strange way, more respectful than anything I'd done for her in years. It assumed she was strong enough to handle it. She was. She just needed time to find out. And the 2 months of silence, I want to be careful about how I describe this because I wasn't trying to punish her. I was simply done explaining myself to someone who wasn't listening. There is a difference between giving up on a person and giving up on a performance. I gave up on performing the role of the endlessly patient, infinitely available, needless mother. That role had been costing me everything. When Vanessa drove up to Sudbury in January, when we sat at my kitchen table with that coffee cake between us, and she actually listened, that didn't come from nowhere. It came from the fact that for the first time, I'd held my ground long enough for her to feel the weight of what she'd been resting on. You can't see a foundation until someone stops letting you take it for granted. I'm not a perfect mother. I made choices early on that made this harder for both of us, but I know now that the most important thing I could offer Vanessa was not money, not co-signatures, not my constant availability. It was the sight of me living my own life with some dignity, hiking on Wednesday mornings, painting bad watercolors, making soup I freeze in portions for no one but myself. It was proof that a woman on her own, past 60, could be genuinely fine, not performing fine. Actually fine. That, I think, is the thing worth passing on.